In the harsh West of 1847, what is the price of a single cup of water? For Tobias Hartwell, a lone rancher, the answer could be his own life. When a blood trail leads him not to a wounded deer, but to a dying Apache warrior collapsed at his own. Well, every survival instinct and every warning screams a single command: raise your rifle. The safe choice is clear, but in the dying man's eyes, Tobias sees not a savage, but a human being. He makes a choice, not with his gun, but with a water bucket. A choice that is about to bring a ruthless marshal, a dark conspiracy, and an entire Apache war party to his doorstep. The dark red trail on the parched earth was an unwelcome path, and it ended right at his water source. Nearly 4 decades on this harsh land had taught Tobias Hartwell how to read nature's silent stories. He knew what the blood of a deer looked like, and this trail, it was telling a different story entirely. As he rounded the corner of his barn, hand tight on his rifle, the sight before him made him freeze. A young Indian warrior had collapsed against the stone wall of the well, one hand pressed tightly to a gaping wound in his side, the other reaching desperately toward the wooden bucket that hung just inches away. The man's breathing was ragged and pained. His dark eyes, though clouded with agony, tracked Tobias's every movement with the alertness of a man who knew death could come from any direction. This was 1847, the kind of time when the presence of an Indian on your land signaled only one thing: trouble. The kind of trouble that could get a man killed in his sleep or burned alive in his own home. Any neighbor within 50 miles would have given him the same advice: put the savage down and bury him, where no one would ever find him. Tobias raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, the expected thing to do. But something in those dark eyes held him back. It wasn't just pain. He saw in them the same searing thirst he'd felt during the drought of '44, when 3 days without a drop of water had made him think he would die. It was the most primal human need, something that transcended skin color, language, or which side of a war you were born on. The warrior tried to speak, his lips cracked and bleeding, but only a whisper escaped: water ... In that instant, Tobias lowered his rifle and reached for the bucket. His neighbors would call him a fool. His brother back east would say the loneliness of the frontier had finally driven him mad. Perhaps they were right. But as he knelt beside this wounded stranger, pressed the wooden rim to the man's lips, and watched him drink like a man saved from the grave, Tobias knew one thing for certain: he had just made a decision that would reshape both their destinies. What he didn't know yet was that this warrior was no ordinary member of the local tribes, and this act of mercy was about to draw more riders to his ranch than he had ever seen in his life. Water poured into the warrior's withered body like a stream of life itself. He drained the first bucket, then the second, and by the third, his trembling hands could finally hold the wooden rim steady. Tobias watched every gulp, his mind racing with the implications of his actions. In this territory, showing mercy to an Indian was like signing your own death warrant. But as a touch of color slowly returned to the warrior's face, Tobias noticed a detail that made the blood in his veins run cold. The wound in the man's side was not from an animal attack or a hunting accident. It was a clean round hole, pierced by hot metal, still oozing blood. Judging by the angle and the black powder burns that stained the edges of the wound, someone had shot him at close range. Extremely close range. That meant whoever had done this was likely still searching, still following the very same blood trail that led straight to Tobias's ranch. They could be riding toward his property right now, with guns loaded and questions Tobias could not answer. The warrior seemed to sense his fear. With a great effort, he raised one hand, pointed toward the horizon, and then drew a finger decisively across his throat. His message could not have been clearer. Danger was coming, and it was coming. Fast. Tobias's heart hammered in his chest. Every survival instinct screamed at him to drag this stranger off his property, to erase the evidence, to pretend this never happened. But the man couldn't even sit up straight, let alone walk. Moving him now would likely kill him, but leaving him here was like hanging a target on both their backs. And then Tobias heard it. The very sound that had kept him alive for over a decade on the frontier. The distant, pounding rhythm of hoofbeats. Multiple horses riding at a full gallop, and their direction was straight for his ranch. The warrior heard them too. His eyes widened with genuine fear, and he tried to shrink himself against the well, as if becoming smaller might somehow make him invisible. Blood immediately began to seep through the fingers he pressed against his wound. Tobias grabbed the empty bucket and frantically doused the blood trail, trying to wash it away, but time had run out. The riders would be there in minutes, perhaps less. He looked down at the warrior, the stranger who had stumbled into his life and turned it upside down in a single afternoon. The man whose presence on his ranch could get them both killed, but whose dark eyes held something Tobias had never seen in an Indian before, a wordless, profound, and pure gratitude. The hoofbeats grew closer, now loud enough to count. 5, maybe 6 horses, all moving at a gallop that suggested this was not a friendly visit. Tobias made his choice in that split second, knowing it might be the last one he ever made. He couldn't carry the wounded man, but he could hide him. The old root cellar behind the barn. If they could just make it in time. But as he bent down to help the warrior to his feet, the man grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and slowly shook his head. Then he did something that sent a chill down Tobias's spine. He smiled. Not the grateful smile of a man being saved, but the knowing smile of one who understood exactly who was coming over that hill. The riders appeared on the ridge, like a flash flood of iron and bone, dust billowing behind them. 6 men on horseback, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. Tobias recognized the leader immediately. Marshall Dixon Webb, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him into every town from here to Santa Fe. Webb was the kind of lawman famous for ending arguments with gunpowder, especially when it came to Indian troubles. He was the kind who would burn down a ranch and everyone in it if he suspected its owner of harboring a fugitive. Tobias stood in front of the well, his body shielding the Indian from view, trying to look like a man with nothing more pressing on his mind than a broken fence post. His throat felt as dry as desert sand. Webb reined in his horse just 10 paces away, close enough for Tobias to see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The other 5 men fanned out in a semicircle, their hands resting on their weapons. This was no social call. "Good afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice a lazy drawl, the voice of a man who knows he holds all the cards. "We're tracking a wounded Indian. The blood trail leads right to your property." Tobias felt sweat bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Haven't seen any Indians, Marshal. Been working on the south fence all day." Webb's eyes swept across the ranch, taking in every detail. The man missed nothing. That's what made him so dangerous. His gaze lingered on the dark stains on the dirt near the well, and Tobias's stomach tightened into a knot. "Is that so?" Webb said, dismounting slowly, deliberately. "Because that sure looks like blood to me, fresh blood. And unless you have a habit of butchering your cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently." Behind Tobias, hidden by the stone wall of the well, the warrior remained perfectly still. But Tobias could feel the tension radiating from him, like heat from a forge. One sound, one movement, and they were both dead men. Webb took 3 more steps, his hand now resting openly on the butt of his pistol. "You know the price for harboring an Indian fugitive, don't you, Hartwell? It's the price of treason. A rope and a sturdy tree until you stop breathing." The Words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring, ready to fight or flee, knowing neither option would save him. Webb was too close. Any sudden move would expose the Indian, and once that happened, bullets would start to fly. And then, the impossible happened. The wounded warrior spoke. Not in English, but in his native tongue. A string of words flowed forth like an underground. Streams suddenly bursting to the surface, clear and strong despite his injury. The words made Marshall Webb freeze mid-step, and his complexion changed from the flush red of a man in power to the pale white of ash. Webb's hand fell from his pistol grip, as if it had touched hot iron. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. When he finally found his voice, it was barely a whisper. "Dear God, it's you." The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons forgotten, their faces showing a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. But it wasn't the fear of facing an enemy. It was the fear of men who realize they have just made a terrible, terrible mistake. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now as white as winter snow. "Do you have any idea who you've been helping?" Tobias stared at Webb's terrified face, his mind spinning. In 12 years on the frontier, he had never seen the ruthless marshal show fear of anything. But now, Webb looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The wounded warrior spoke again, this time in perfect English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire ranch. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me." Webb's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's. "This is Ayana, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring." The ground seemed to fall away beneath Tobias's feet. The peace treaty. The same treaty that had ended 3 years of brutal warfare between the settlers and the Apache. The same treaty that had saved hundreds of lives on both sides. And he had just given water to the man who had made it all possible. But if Ayana is a peacemaker, Tobias wondered aloud, why is he fleeing the law with a bullet in his side? It was a trap, Ayana continued, his breathing still labored but his voice growing stronger. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty. But someone else had other plans. Webb's face went from white to a sickly gray. "Colonel Morrison is dead. Shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder." "Because that is what they want you to believe," Ayana said, pushing himself straighter against the well. "Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men wearing war paint who could speak just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet." The scattered pieces in Tobias's mind suddenly clicked into a terrifying picture. Someone had staged the murder to frame Ayana. Someone wanted the peace treaty destroyed. Someone wanted this territory to burn again. Who? Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ayana's dark eyes hardened like flint. "The same men who have been selling guns to the renegade tribes. The same men who have made a fortune from this war. The same men who sent you here to finish me, instead of looking for the real killers." Webb took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon before stopping. "You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations. And they will remain accusations until I can prove them," Ayana replied. "Which is why they need me dead before I can reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead. Why they are counting on men like you to finish what they started." The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Tobias could see the war happening behind Webb's eyes. He was trapped between orders and the truth, between duty and conscience. And men like Webb didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. That's when Ayana played his final card. With trembling fingers, He reached into a small leather pouch at his side and pulled out a piece of paper, folded in four, stained with his own blood. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter as if it might burst into flames. What does it say? It says Morrison discovered who has been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes. Names, dates, amounts. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Ayana's eyes never left Webb's face. Including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. Those words struck Webb like a physical blow. His face shifted through several shades before settling on a sickly green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes. Tobias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He was witnessing the moment a corrupt lawman realized his own neck was on the chopping block. "You're lying," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Ayana held up the letter. "Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died. He told me to get it to Fort Richardson if anything happened to him. He said it was insurance. Give me that letter." Webb snarled, but before he could move, something unexpected happened. Deputy Bradley, the young man with anxious eyes, dismounted and walked slowly toward the well, his hands raised peacefully. "Marshal, I've been thinking about something. Remember that shipment of rifles reported stolen 3 months ago? The one we were told the Indians took." Webb's face darkened. "What about it?" "I saw those very rifles 2 weeks later." Bradley's young face was flushed with either courage or fear. "In the hands of settlers heading south. It made me wonder who was really stealing from whom." That confession was like a crack that broke the dam of silence. The other deputies began to nod, exchanging meaningful glances, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. And Tobias realized Ayana had just done something remarkable. Without firing a shot or raising his voice, he had turned Webb's own men against him. But Webb was not the kind of man to go down without a fight. A cornered animal is always the most dangerous, and Tobias could see the exact moment the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than the truth. "You are all fools," Webb snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping away. "You think the word of this savage means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dead Indian and a handful of traitors?" The deputies spread out instinctively, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Tobias could see the hesitation in their eyes. Years of following orders were at war with the growing realization that those orders might be wrong. Ayana struggled to his feet, using the stone well for support. Blood seeped through the fingers pressed against his wound, but his voice remained steady. "The truth does not care who speaks it, Marshal. It simply is." "The truth," Webb spat, "is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm here to collect the bounty on your head." He drew his pistol in one smooth motion, the barrel swinging toward Ayana, but before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into the line of fire, his own weapon now drawn. "Stand down, Marshal." The command cracked like thunder across the ranch. 4 other deputies followed Bradley's lead, their guns now trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained loyal to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, who looked as corrupt as his boss. "You're making the mistake, boys," Webb said, sweat now beading on his forehead. "A mistake that will cost you your badges, maybe your lives." "Maybe," Bradley replied, "but I've made enough mistakes following your orders. I won't make any more." And then Ayana did something no one expected. He began to sing, not in English, but in Apache. A low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ancient words carried across the ranch like wind through a canyon, speaking of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stand together against the darkness. The effect was immediate and startling. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, not understanding the words but feeling their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily mesmerized by the sound. And while they listened, transfixed, Ayana was doing something else entirely. He was calling to his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind to ears that knew how to listen. Tobias realized this with a chill that ran down his spine. Ayana wasn't just singing. He was summoning. The melody ended, and silence fell over the ranch like a heavy blanket. But in that silence, Tobias heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, distant, but growing closer. Many hoofbeats, moving very fast. Webb heard them too. His face went pale as moonlight. How many? Ayana smiled despite the pain. Enough. The sound grew louder, multiplying until it sounded like thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Tobias's ranch, and they would be there in minutes. They appeared on the horizon like a vision from another world. 50 Apache warriors on horseback, moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that defied everything. He thought he knew about Indian war parties. They were not coming for battle. Leading the group was an elderly chief whose presence commanded respect from 100 yards away. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignity of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Behind him rode warriors of all ages, but their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation. He still held his pistol trained on Tobias, but his hand shook like a man with a fever. The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Their chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the well where his son waited. With each step, the old man's eyes never left Ayana's face, searching for signs of serious injury. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred. The reunion of a leader with his people, of a father with his child, of a peace negotiator with those he had sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands checking the wound, his face grave with concern. When the conversation ended, he turned to face Webb, his eyes like black diamonds. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. "Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him." Webb's pistol wavered. "I came to arrest a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been profiting from the war between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air. "You have no proof," Webb said, but his voice cracked. The chief smiled not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the testimony of the men who tried to kill my son before they died, trying to escape our justice, and we have something else." He gestured to one of his warriors who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen. "Your correspondence with the gunrunners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to cover your tracks." Webb's world collapsed in that moment, but a cornered animal is unpredictable. Webb swung his pistol toward the chief, desperation overriding common sense. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." What happened next moved faster than thought. Ayana threw himself between the gun and his father, despite his wound. 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unison, but the shot went wild, flying high into the sky. Because Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who just wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshall Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and fury. When the dust settled, Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins. The chief walked slowly to where Tobias sat catching his breath in the dirt. He placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache, words that carried the weight of ceremony. Of honor, Ayana translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, from this day, you are a brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for the truth, choosing courage over fear, these are the actions of a true warrior. Tobias felt something shift in his chest. Looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he had never earned from his own people. As the sun set, Ayana, his wound now treated, clasped Tobias's hand. Last time, you saved more than my life today, my brother. You saved the peace between our peoples. I just gave a thirsty man some water, Tobias replied. Ayana smiled. Sometimes, that is how the world is changed. One cup of water at a time. 24 hours later, just as promised, they were gone. But they had left something precious behind. Proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human decency could still work miracles. The next morning, the silence on Tobias's ranch was heavier than ever before. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the quiet of a place that had witnessed history. The yard was trampled by hoofprints. The air still seemed to hold a phantom scent of sweat and tension. And leaning against the barn wall, where Tobias had placed it with reverence, was the war lance. Its eagle feathers stirred in the morning breeze, as if whispering of an oath, of a bond forged by a single cup of water. Weeks passed. News on the frontier traveled slowly, distorted by the telling of travelers, but eventually, it spread. The story of the standoff at Hartwell's ranch. Some called him a traitor, an Indian lover who had turned his back on his own kind. Old neighbors avoided him, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. They could not understand how a man could risk his life for a savage. But others, families, in the farther settlements who had lost so much in the war, told a different story. They spoke of a lone man who had stood up to corruption, who had saved the peace with a single act of courage. To them, Tobias Hartwell was a hero. That autumn, official news from the territorial capital finally reached the remote regions. Webb and Hawkins had been tried. Morrison's letter, along with the ledgers the Apache chief had produced, was undeniable. Proof: they were convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The gun-running network was dismantled to its roots. The peace treaty was not only renewed but expanded to include all the tribes in the territory, just as Ayana had hoped. A fragile but hopeful era of peace had begun. Tobias never saw fame or recognition. His life continued to the familiar rhythm of the land, mending fences, tending to his stock, and watching the western mountains change color as the sun went down. But he was no longer alone. Sometimes when he looked to the horizon, he would see a lone rider on a distant ridge, their silhouette long in the twilight. They never came close, never spoke a word, but their presence was a reminder. A vigil, a silent respect between brothers. He had become a bridge between two worlds, a man whose kindness had proven stronger than gunpowder. And he realized that sometimes, in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles were not won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful. It was the courage to see the human being in your enemy, and the wisdom to choose compassion over fear.